In the entire module, we have been looking at the aspect of urbanization, but we have also been coming in to understand how actually urbanization relates to migration, and we're able to understand that these are two correlating factors or issues in demography. And today we want to now integrate migration into the idea of urbanization that we've early learned, and we're just going to start with the simple term of defining migration. And we're defining migration as a form of geographical or spatial mobility involving a change of usual residence between clearly defined geographic units. And we're saying that some of the changes of residence, however, are temporary or short term, and therefore they do not involve changes in usual residence. These include mostly because of the short nature of the temporary or the temporary nature of movement, they are most times excluded from the statistics on migration. And they include brief excursions for visiting, vacations, or business, even across national boundaries. For example, movement into, if someone left probably Sudan to go to another country for a business trip or for vacation or for visitation of their family, that is not necessarily recorded as a migration most times. And that is the difference we are putting up here. Other changes in residence, although permanent, are short distance movements and hence are also excluded from the data on migration. In practice, therefore, such short distance movements affect the scope of internal but not international migration. So, therefore, the term migration has in general usage been restricted to relatively permanent changes in residence between specifically designated political or statistical areas, or between type of residence areas, e.g., the rural to urban migration. So, in other words, what we're saying here is that someone moving from one homestead to another within a same village may not be seen as a migration. That is why we're looking at the term designated political area or statistical area. So if your statistical organization therefore describes a particular place such as a district or a province, then the movement away from a province can insinuate a migration. Or the smallest unit, which is a village, a movement away from that village to another might insinuate a migration, because it might affect the village population in there. However, a movement within that village may not be considered as a migration in that sense. So, for demographic purposes, we have two broad types of migration that we identify. One is the international migration and the internal migration. And where the international migration refers to the movement across national boundaries, and it is designated as immigration from the standpoint of a nation from which the movement occurs, and as immigration from that of the receiving nation. So, in other words, we are also defining, whereas we are defining international migration and internal migration, we are also defining the aspect of emigration, which is this here, and we are also defining immigration here. And this, in other words, emigration looks at a person who is living in another country, and we are looking at immigration here as someone who is actually from the receiving end. So these are very key definitions that you should be able to understand in this concept of migration. Therefore, the term internal migration refers to migration within the boundaries of a given country, and the distinction between international and internal migration is not always clear because the non-self-governing territories have some, but not all the characteristics of independent states. So it is the role of the governing bodies in those particular countries or boundaries to define the characteristics of their migration. So at a district or at a country level, migration from one district to another might be considered as an internal migration in there. So those are key definitions we would want to go through. But also, we very well know that in our discussions that migration is the third of an area. The other two factors being birth and deaths. And we already discussed births and deaths in our previous discussions. Therefore, the importance of migration is affecting the growth and the decline of populations and in modifying the demographic characteristics of areas of origin and areas of destination has long been recognized. Therefore, what we need to understand here and be able to perceive properly is that migration plays a very important role in actually affecting the demographic characteristics. In other words, when we're referring to demographic characteristics, we're looking at issues such as sex ratio, we're looking at morbidity, we're looking at mortality rates, we're looking at fertility rates, and we're looking at the population components such as the levels of education, we're looking at employment levels, we're looking at urban-rural residence. So, in other words, we are referring to the fact that either people are leaving a particular country or a particular territory to join another territory. Therefore, it affects where people are living from, but it also affects where people are moving to. So, in particular, migration is a very important element in the growth of the population and the labor force of an area. The knowledge of the number and characteristics of persons entering or leaving an area is required, therefore. And together with the census data that we have as our source of migration data, the census data on population size and vital statistics are used to analyze the changes in the structure of the population and the labor force of an area. So in our previous lectures, we were able to look at the population pyramid, and the majority of our developing countries have our triangle population pyramid. And that same population pyramid can be affected by the mortality and birth rates, but also can be affected by migration as the three key core factors that affect our population. And therefore, we are mentioning a few sources of our migration data here. And for us to be able to understand the trends in migration, it is often important that we use these data sources. So the measurement and the analysis of migration are very important in the preparation of population estimates, but also projections for a nation or for parts of the nation. And therefore, data on such factors, such as the sex, such as age, such as citizenship, mother tongue, the duration of residence, occupation, and education of the immigrant, facilitate an understanding of the nature and the magnitude of the problem. And as a student of demography, this is where your interest should always be. That you have to look at the impact of sex, the impact of age, the impact of someone's citizenship, someone's mother tongue, the duration of their residence, the occupation of that person, the education level. You have to understand those demographics for you to be able to depict the problem of both the social and the cultural problems that might emanate from those demographic characteristics of that individual. And the social and the cultural integration occurs in areas that are affected by very heavy immigration. So for countries that are affected by more influx of people, you must be able to understand the nature and the magnitude of the problem, first socially, but also due to the cultural integration that happens. And therefore, you can only be able to define the magnitude if you can be able to subject that particular population to those demographic characteristics. And therefore, it is very vital that you collect information on those demographic characteristics of everyone that enters into the country. So we just want to understand some of the importances, or we want to just understand what different brains or different people from different careers would want to understand in regarding to migration. So for the sociologists, migration is concerned with social and psychological effects of migration and on the migrant especially, and on the host populations, and sending areas and the acculturation and adjustment of migrant populations. So in other words, the sociologist would want to understand what the social impacts are on the migrants themselves, but also on the receiving country or area, but also the area that is sending, or the area that is where these particular migrants are coming from. Whereas the economist would be interested in the relation of the migration to the business cycle. In other words, the supply of skilled and unskilled labor, the growth of the industry, and the occupational and employment status of the migrants. So, in other words, the economist would want to understand that trend, whether the population that is coming in is population that has certain skills, or they are really unskilled, and therefore looks at all the other characteristics that are very important in economics. But also the legislators and the political scientists are more concerned with the formulation of policies and laws regarding immigration, and to a lesser extent, internal migration and enfranchisement and voting behavior of the migrants. Therefore, for politicians, they would want to understand, or they would want to aim at making laws that probably bar immigrants, people who are coming into the country, or those who are leaving to another country, from either participating or decision making in the country. So the policies would be in regard to whether they can allow those who have migrated away from the country to engage in any of the activities that take place within the country itself. So, what are some of the key characteristics regarding migration? One is that it involves physical movement of people, not goods, not ideas. So it is mainly people who are moving here. But also it has a geographical scale, and it can be within a country, or it can be across the borders. It also has a duration. Depending on the reason and the circumstance, it can either be temporary, or it can be permanent. Then another characteristic is that migration has a variation in the definitions, and some definitions emphasize movement across border, especially the International Organization for Migration, but also others include movement within a country for a specified duration, and that can be the definition by the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. But every other country, for the purpose of having a standardized way of data collection, will have a standard definition for what it understands by migration. So what are some of the reasons for migration? We will just run through very fast because these are very easy and very quick to understand in here. So we have the push factors that are negative factors in the origin location, such as poverty, conflict, or environmental degradation. But also we have pull factors, such as the positive factors in the destination location, like better job opportunities and educational facilities. So the drivers of migration is what we want to look at here. And one of the major drivers is that there are economic factors, such as the job opportunities, the educational attainment, poverty, population surge, and urbanization. But also there is environmental factors, such as natural disasters, environmental degradation, issues of floods, droughts, and desertification. And then we have the political factors as well, issues of dictatorship, war, coups, political asylum, and governance structures. Then the social factors come in as major drivers of migration, issues such as marriage, recreation, social security, and the desire for change. Two is that we have classifications as drivers of migration, and one we're looking at classifications according to the UN, and the UN classifies them as economic and demographic drivers. Then it has environmental drivers, human-made crisis as well. Then there are specific classifications by Carling and Terrace in 2016. One is the desire for change, blockage of transition to independent adulthood. In other words, if someone realizes that socially they are being denied transition to independence, especially the young people, they will decide to migrate. And therefore, for you, instead of looking at migration as some of the factors that are leading to migration, you should be able to understand probably or mainly your interest should be probably, because if you looked at your population pyramid, you should be able to understand that at a certain age there are more people, more young people who migrate away from a country to go to they might even be migrating around or within the country. But migration between the young people compared to the adults or children, you should be able to understand the relationship. And it is a very interesting research that you should be able to do. You should be able to explain or you should be able to understand the causes of the difference between of the difference in migration among, or you do a comparison for the differences in the migration trend between the young people, the elderly, and children. And you should be able to from this Carling and Terrace classification, you will be able to understand some of the reasons as to why young people are more often moving away or within their country, other than the other age categorizations. So that is the aspect that you should be able to look at. As well, if you're looking at economic and demographic drivers, you should be able to understand the economic and demographic drivers across the entire characteristics of the population. What is the economic and demographic drive within the female and the male, between urban and within the age groups? You should be able to understand the trend. And amazingly, you can even use comparisons between those who are employed and those who are unemployed. You can even use as well a comparison between school going and out of school. So you'll be able to differentiate whether the economic and demographic drivers are the same within those characteristics of the population. So some of the additional drivers include the push factors, which we already looked at, and therefore we want to just understand quickly the classification and the types of migration here. And because we'll just run through these ones quickly because they are what we've actually discussed earlier on. So one is that in the classification, we are classifying them based on the nature of movement. And therefore, based on the nature of movement, we have two types. One is immigration, which is movement to another country, and emigration, which is movement from another country. Therefore, emigration is moving out, and immigration is the receiving country. Then we are also doing classification according to the on permanency of residence, and we are defining that there are those who have permanent migration who do not have any plan to return to their places of origin, but also we have those who move temporarily, and these are migration for a limited time. Then there's choice-based, mainly, which we type as voluntary, and then as well we have the forced migration, which is as a result of conflict, persecution, among others, might be environmental related issues as well. And then the third classification is one that is based on location, and we are having two, meaning the international and the internal migration that we looked at earlier on. And the internal migration is movement within the country, whereas international is one that is across the country. Then there are other types, but also we use them as analysis. And one is what we call gross migration, which is the total arrivals, which are the immigrants and the departures. And it is what we use to define or to determine our population estimates. Therefore, for you to have your gross population, you would have your total people who are coming into the country minus those who are leaving the country. Then you have the net migration, which is the difference between the immigrants and the emigrants. And then we have the impelled migration, which is the movement due to unfavorable conditions, which we looked at earlier on. We have step migrations, which is the progressive migration to a further destination. So you move to this country, you stay there, or you move to a particular province, and then you stay there. After some time, you continue with your destination. So we are defining it as the step migration. Then there is also what we refer to as the chain migration, which is the series of migrations by a defined group where people are moving to, it's a whole group that is shifting from a particular place to another. And historically, we saw this happen during the Bantu movement, where you see a whole clan migrate from this area to another. So that whole defined group of probably by culture or definition by economy, probably by type of work, or their definition by religion. So there are different characteristics through which the chain migration can happen. So there are different defined groups in that particular aspect. Therefore, that movement by that defined group is what we're referring to as the chain migration. Then there comes the rural-urban migration. We have the interregional migration, where this is movement between regions within a country. And we're referring to regions, but it can also be movement within provinces in a country. So people moving from one province to another, or people moving from one region from the east to the west within a particular country. So this is within the country. Here we're not referring to broader regional contexts such as the East African region and so forth. We're not referring to that. We also have the intercontinental migration, which is the movement between continents, people moving from Africa to the Europe, to South America, to North America, to Australia, and so forth. All those to Europe and so forth. That is more of continental. But there's also intracontinental, which means you're moving within the same continent, especially moving within Africa. Then we have our classification based on political boundaries, and there is what we call internal, which is within a country. But also within a country, we have immigrants that are arriving at the destination, then out migrants that are leaving the origin. So this again gives us another key term here that we need to look at. We're looking at in-migration. We're looking at in-migration and out-migration. And here we're looking at these two contexts because this is internal migration, movement within the country. And then if it is movement within a country, if someone is going from one province to another, which we refer to as interregional, the province where people are living, the province that is receiving people or where people are arriving, that is what we call in-migrants. Whereas this one that is where people are living, it's what we refer to as the out-migrants. Then again, the international migration here that has the immigrants and the emigrants, where people are entering and then leaving a particular country. Then we're also proceeding to have the classification that is based on movement patterns, and we're saying there is step migration, which we have looked at, and then we're looking at circular migration as well, which is the cyclical movement between origin and destination. And we go ahead to define them as seasonal migration, and then which is driven by seasonal labor demands, and then the return migration, which is the one-time migration and the return after a stay. So in other words, especially for those who are agricultural or pastoralists, this circular migration is very common, where they leave their particular area and move to another territory in search of probably a job, or probably for their animals, for pasture. But after they return back, when the seasons are done, they return back to their original stay. Then we also looked at the chain migration already, and we're just trying to brief here that migration of families at different stages of life also occurs. And then we are looking at the seventh classification as one that is based on decision making, one being the voluntary migration, which is based on a free will and the desire for improvement. And this probably gives us a reason as to why we have more youth that move away from a certain area at that youthful age or at their middle ages, partly in search of the desire for improvement, and because at the youthful age, the social factor or the society demands a little more on you in terms of achieving, and therefore that pressure could allow people to make voluntary decisions and therefore desire more improvement. But also we looked at involuntary already, which is mostly because of environmental or political situations, but could also be as a result of social pressure. And sometimes the social pressure can also turn to be involuntary because you're being forced by psychologically and so forth. And then we look at within the involuntary, we look at the reluctant and the impelled migration, which is encouraged location due to pressure, like I have said, but also the forced migration, which is unable to return home as a result of internally displaced persons or the refugees. This is because of the political and environmental factors. Internally might be as a result of political, but also can be environmental factors such as floods, landslides, drought, and prolonged sunshine, and so forth. Then that takes us to the aspect of migration patterns, and we're saying that humans have migrated for millions of years, and therefore that has shaped the contemporary settlement pattern, influence cultural, political, economic, and social landscapes. And if you're looking at an idea of how what that statement means, it is important that you go and make a research on the impact of migration on culture, on politics, on economics, and social landscape. You will be able to understand how migration has impacted culturally, but also you're able to see the cultural shifts that have occurred as a result of migration. And you're able to see that within Africa actually played a very key role in changing or in influencing the culture. And it can start from fashion, it can move to religion, it can move to cultural practices, it can move to cultural values, it can move to beliefs, cultural beliefs, and so forth. So you'll be able to test that. But also, you should be able to look at the influence of migration on cultural, on culture, and how it has influenced uptake of reproductive health services. You should be able to look at how the impact or the influence of migration on politics and how it has impacted the uptake of reproductive health services. Similarly, you should also be able to look at the impact of migration on the social landscape and how it has been able to impact or how it affects reproductive health services. So you'll be able to look at a variety of issues. And just to give you an idea of how you would look at this, you're able to see that due to the migration patterns of international movements, you're able to see that people are now moving away socially from using natural family planning methods into the aspect of the modern family planning methods. And all these kind of interactions is a result of migration. So people migrate due to political instability, which we have sung over time. And similarly, in that brief that I gave you, we have also been able to look at the issues of and the types of migration. So the current trend is that Africa currently leads in migration due to conflicts, due to the poverty levels, due to the environmental issues, among others. Europe and America are major receiving regions for migrants. And remittances sent by migrants play a very significant role in the economies of sending countries. And for us, we want to understand the role that migration plays in our economies, because we are the countries that are sending, and therefore the different roles that migration plays would include how it is leading to deteriorating economies, but it's also leading to issues of population growth and so forth. So you will go ahead and understand the significance of migration on Africa, especially. You might look at Africa as a broader country, and also you might look at South Sudan as a country itself, because you would want to understand the significance of forced migration, which is as a result of the instability that we're facing because of the conflicts. So you would want to understand the impact of forced migration on the economy of South Sudan, and you'll be able to understand some of the huge impacts. And you can even go ahead and understand the social impact. You can look at the political impact. You can as well look at the impact on youth, the impact on gender, and so forth. So you look at it broadly. You can as well look at the impact of forced migration on reproductive health services, public health services, and so forth and so on. But also, as we summarize here, the impacts of migration, we have some positives and negatives, like we defined earlier on. And here we want to look at the positives, such as the transfer of skilled labor. There is also contribution into development in both the origin and destination. And this is if the policies are proper. And that's why we've seen many of our colleagues who have gone to developed countries sending income or sending money back to their countries of origin, and you see developmental issues taking place. And that is how positive the impact can be. But also remittances from migrants boost the economy. Most times when you move into a country, there are some remittances you make. There are some taxes that you pay, and these taxes can help to boost the economy. Then the migrants also contribute to increase the global GDP, and as a result, when GDP increases, you understand that the economy is also able to improve, because then the number of people who are able to have a better standard of living are improving. But also there is increased cultural diversity, and it leads to coexistence because people are able to coexist within the cultural diversity. But also the advantage with cultural diversity is that it can act as a learning platform, as well as through tourism for incomes. Then there's another impact is that it strengthens the public service through the skilled migrants. When you have doctors, when you have engineers, which is mostly what is occurring in the developed world, where they are encouraging skilled migration from especially Africa, you'll have an increased or you'll strengthen your public systems, because then people who are migrating to your country are actually people who are improving on your labor service. Then we have the negative impacts, such as forced displacement, migrant deaths, forced labor among migrants, internal displacement due to the natural disasters, pressure on resources. So when you're looking at the negative impacts, I wouldn't prefer looking at the negative impacts just such as forced displacement, migrant deaths. I want us to look at the negative impact of migration, specifically on reproductive health services. You also have to look at the negative impact of migration, specifically on youth, specifically on women of reproductive age, specifically on culture, specifically on age, or on a specific age group. So other than these broader impacts, which are very easy to look at, as forced labor and so forth, you should be able to look at the impact at a very specific level, and that is what I implore you to go ahead and understand better. What is the negative impact of migration on reproductive health services? You'll be able to understand it better. You'll be able to understand probably if people are coming into a country or into a certain area, there's going to be a stretch on the services, on the few available facilities, and therefore, meaning the quality of the service may reduce. There might be over workload on the health, on the staff. You might realize it will lead to the long queues, waiting in there, but also the need, the unmet needs will increase because there are more people, but yet the service providers are few. It also has an impact on information because of the diversity of migrants. The chances that negative information towards the reproductive health services might also come in. So those are the issues I want us to look at mainly and understand as scholars of demography and reproductive health. But also, if you're not specifically doing reproductive health, if you're doing dietary, you should be able to look at the negative impacts of migration on nutrition and dietary. You should be able to look at the negative impacts of migration on environment specifically, and you'll be able to understand this concept in a broader way. So there is potential rise in crime rates, underpopulation in sending countries, increased competition, challenges of migrant acceptance and xenophobic attacks, the difficulties in assimilation for migrants, so they may struggle to fit in a new environment, but also the host community might be hostile to them. Then there are cultural and religious clashes because the migrants might come with their own cultural beliefs, and that is the interaction we needed to look at. And you can even be able to understand and compare the trend of cultural and religious beliefs within refugee hosting communities, and you'll be able to document some of the challenges or some of the different trends that are in there. Then we look at the rural and urban migration, which we described as movement of people from rural areas to the urban centers. And it is very common. Earlier on, we already described that Africa is experiencing a huge trend of the movement of people away from the rural areas to urban areas for the reasons we already enlisted. And this is a common and ongoing trend with significant social, economic, cultural, and political impacts. And therefore, it is important that you understand the impact of rural-urban migration on the social, or you can be able to understand the social impact of rural and urban migration, whereas even the economic impacts. And the causes we already looked at, but we're just briefing quickly through them. And as our time is fast spent, we would go through people migrate to cities seeking for better opportunities, employment, and higher wages, access to infrastructure, and then education and governance. And then we want to conclude with the positive impacts of rural-urban migration. And we're saying there is improved living standards for migrants. There is a reduced pressure on rural land with low productivity. There is also potential for ecosystem recovery because people are moving away from the rural areas. The places they had dilapidated with the they are depleted with the cutting trees, settlement. It can then the rural area can be able to recover because of this urban movement. Then the contribution to rural development through remittances and community involvements. So as people move to the urban centers, they will be able to remit their income back to those who are at home. And then we can be able to see the rural areas develop because of those remittances. And the negative impacts is that there is low-skilled migrant because people are moving from rural areas and they are not skilled. When they reach to the urban areas, they end up having low-paying jobs, and you see the slums rising up and coming up. Then we have the potential for income loss in sending households because you're sending people away from the rural areas. If you're sending the breadwinner, then the household may become, their source of income will be reduced. Then there is strain on the resources and the infrastructure in the cities because the population is growing and more people are coming to the city. The resources in the city will be strained. So that is where we would want to end for today, where then from tomorrow we can be able to run through quickly through the social integration of migrants, and we shall be able to look at migration and development and so forth, and then be able to summarize probably by the start of next week. We can be able to summarize that. So I would wish to end there for now, unless we have any questions regarding what I have presented. Any comments, any questions, then?
Yeah, much for the lecture, sir. It's a nice one, precise with simple explanation. Yeah, however, I've not understood well the difference between immigration and emigration, and what term is given to people who migrate from one country to another and they permanently settle there. Thank you.
Okay, that is noted. Any other question? Okay, so for those who permanently move away from a country, we refer to them as that is still international migration because they have moved from their country boundaries to another country. So we refer to them as international migration. And when they get their citizen status, then they become citizens of that particular country, the other side. However, for us, we consider them from where they are living from, they are international migrants. However, we remember we have different classifications for the reason as to why people are moving away. So the person might have an international migration, but it might be a forced migration as well, probably because of the instability, because of the political instability that is occurring in the country where the person is living to go to another country. So, but when the person moves here, the classification is we are using boundary as well as the reason. So the reason for migration, if you wanted to define that movement as by reason, you would classify it as forced migration because of the reason of movement. But if it's because of the location, you would classify it as an international migration because the person has left international boundaries. That is one. And just to take you back to the slide that explains immigration and immigration, here it is. So if you're to look at immigration that starts with E, we're saying that immigration is movement that occurs from the standpoint of the nation. Where like for someone is living, if point A is the country, if part A is the country, someone is moving away from part A to point B. So from the movement from point A to point B is what we refer to as immigration. Because you're entering a country, that point B, who is receiving you, it's what we call immigration. So the country that receives, the receiving nation, will call it as immigration. Then the country that you're living from is called immigration. I hope those distinctions or the explanation as I've made are able to answer the question you had answered. I mean, you had asked, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I've already picked it. Thank you.
Okay. So unless we have any other questions, if they are not there, I would like to wish you a very good night and end there. Then we can have our discussions tomorrow.